The Senate will be led in prayer by the Senate chaplain, Reverend Dr. Richard C. Howells.
Let us pray. God that made the world and all things therein, hath made of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed, and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord. Eternal God, the Apostle Paul reminds us that thou art a sovereign Lord, that thou hast determined the times and the boundaries of the nations, that they should seek the Lord. When we read the words of our founding fathers, we become aware of the profound faith in thee which inspired them. It is not for nothing that our currency bears the words, "In God we trust." But we tend to behave as though we have no need of thee. Mighty God, all-wise, all-powerful, and unchanging, before it is too late, awaken us as a nation to our need of thee, that we may seek thee and serve thee, individually and corporately. We pray in the name of Jesus, King of kings and Lord of lords. Amen.
The Senate will be in order. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, there will now be a period for the transaction of morning business, for not to extend beyond the hour of 10:30 a.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for not to exceed 5 minutes each. Special orders have been entered for the senator from Connecticut, Mr. Lieberman, to be recognized for up to 5 minutes. The senator from Massachusetts, Mr. KERRY, to be recognized for up to 15 minutes. The senator from Florida, Mr. Graham, to speak for up to 15 minutes. The senator from New Jersey, Mr. Bradley, to speak for up to 15 minutes. The chair, in his capacity as a senator from the state of West Virginia, notes the absence of a quorum. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Baucus.
Does the senator ask that the quorum call be rescinded?
Yes, I would ask for unanimous.
Without objection, the call for the quorum is rescinded, and the senator from North Carolina is recognized for not to exceed 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, today I am announcing the introduction of a comprehensive welfare reform proposal that I have been working on with two of my distinguished colleagues and good friends, Senator Grassley of Iowa and Senator Brown of Colorado. They have been true leaders for a long time in the endeavor for welfare reform, as well as in their pursuit of fiscal responsibility. I appreciate their leadership, support on this most important issue for our nation. Mr. President, before coming to the Senate, I spent 45 years in the private sector, meeting a payroll as a businessman and farmer. Every year I watched as the Congress came into session and adjourned, leaving it more difficult for working taxpayers and businessmen to make ends meet because of excessive government spending programs that have put our country on the path to an economic disaster. Out of all the spending programs implemented by the federal government, I do not know of a group that has been a bigger failure than those collectively known as welfare. Since President Johnson declared war on poverty in 1965, almost 30 years ago, the current price tag of that failed effort is now $5 trillion and growing daily. In the past 5 years alone, total welfare spending has more than doubled. Government welfare programs, often well-intended, have destroyed the initiative of whole generations of our citizens. Our nation and the poor have gotten into the present fix because of a common sense principle, and that is you get more of what you pay for. And for the past 30 years, the federal government has paid people not to work. The federal government has paid people to have children out of wedlock. And the federal government has paid people to remain unmarried. Mr. President, it does not make common sense or show good judgment what we've been doing. In 1992, federal, state, and local spending on welfare programs was over $300 billion. Welfare programs are not currently subject to spending caps or any discretionary review by the Congress. That means we end up spending vastly more than we can afford based solely on numbers generated by welfare bureaucrats encouraging welfare recipients. I propose we place a cap on the growth of welfare entitlement programs. In so doing, we must restrict the long-term aggregate growth of welfare spending to 3.5% per year. This would prevent welfare spending from growing faster than inflation. Individual programs would be permitted to grow more than 3.5%, but others would have to grow less. But the total aggregate growth of the 76 programs, Medicaid not included, must be held at or below 3.5% per year. It is estimated that this will save $80 billion over 5 years. President Clinton's welfare proposal will increase spending on welfare from $10 to $58 billion over the same period of time. Serious welfare reform means spending less money, not more money. I call on President Clinton to endorse this plan for placing a cap on welfare spending. If he truly wants to end welfare as we know it, as he has said many times, if he truly wants to reduce the dependency upon welfare, then the President should come forth and endorse this bill, which is true welfare reform and will do what he promised when he was campaigning, and that is end welfare as we have known it. Those 76 programs would be converted into a single discretionary block grant to the states. This would allow the states the authority to increase or decrease funding on particular programs based upon that program's success in that particular state and how it best served that state. Mr. President, if we are going to begin a real reform of the system, we must address the root cause that has been fueling the welfare bureaucracy for 30 years, and that is illegitimacy. We must limit benefits to unwed teenage mothers in order to take away the current cash incentive to have more and more out of wedlock children at government and taxpayers' expense. This bill will eliminate direct payments, except medical aid, to unmarried women under 21 years old who have children out of wedlock. All direct payments would be eliminated. All welfare money, which would have gone directly to the unwed mother, is converted into a block grant to the state.
The Senator's 5 minutes have expired.
I would ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to speak for about 2 more minutes.
Without objection, the Senator is recognized for 2 additional minutes.
This would allow the states the opportunity to develop new and innovative programs to combat illegitimacy while taking away the cash incentive for young women to have more children out of wedlock. Currently, 30% of all American children are born to single mothers. 30%. That's wrong. We need to promote and reward the institution of marriage. That is why this bill provides tax credit to low-income married couples with children. It only makes common sense to expect that people who are being given a helping hand by the working people of America, the taxpayers, should be expected to at least do a day's work themselves. The bill establishes serious but sensible work requirements while requiring far more welfare recipients to work than any other proposal. We target work requirements on those welfare recipients who have the least justification for being out of the labor force. All single, able-bodied adults without children who receive food stamps would be required to perform community service. We would also require half of all single mothers receiving aid to families with dependent children benefits to work for their benefits, with the priority going to women with children over age 5. This allows the children to reach school age before the mothers are required to work and thereby avoids the high cost of daycare. Mr. President, the working taxpayers who struggle every day with no guarantee should not be expected to work to guarantee a way of life for those who choose not to work. As I have said many times before, we need workfare and not welfare in this country. Finally, the search for welfare reform can only come from spending the taxpayers' money more wisely. The FAIRCLOTH, Grassley-Brown Real Welfare Reform Act of 1994 is the best means to that end. I thank the chair and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Indiana, Mr. Lugar, is recognized for not to exceed 5 minutes.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I may be permitted to speak for 10 minutes.
Is there objection? Hearing no objection, the senator will be recognized for not to exceed 10 minutes.
Mr. President, President Clinton has commenced a consultation process with the congressional leadership in regard to continuing China's current trade status. Various members are working with the White House staff in an effort to develop a compromise that might include limited sanctions while permitting a considerable amount of trade to continue if China fails to meet the administration's human rights objectives. Several members of the Senate have spoken on this issue. My interest is not in debating the merits or demerits of targeted revocation of MFN status. Rather, I want to suggest that this debate is perhaps too narrow and misses the mark. The trade and human rights components of our China policy have been joined by a strategic component that belies the utility of any linkages in our policy. We must face the growing nuclear proliferation threat in the region as exemplified by the North Korean nuclear program and the need to bolster our diplomatic and negotiating position while simultaneously considering the imposition of sanctions on North Korea. Both will require the full support and full implementation by countries in the region, and most specifically China. The practice of tying our human rights objectives in China to the continuation of MFN status for China, even if in a more limited and targeted way, makes less likely Chinese willingness to avoid a Security Council veto on any sanctions resolution. Or even should China abstain in such vote, full participation in carrying out such sanctions. A limited, targeted U.S. approach in conditioning the renewal of China's MFN status is likely to beget limited Chinese pressure on North Korea to be more forthcoming in the negotiations, as well as conditional Chinese participation, if any, in sanctions initiated against North Korea. This is not to suggest that we should lessen energetic pursuit of our human rights objectives in China, even as we pursue the increasing trade and business opportunities offered by the fastest growing economy in Asia. But I do suggest that the linkage or conditional approach, even if practiced in a more nuanced and targeted way, denies the United States the ability to set policy priorities in the region. To our policy objectives of the promotion of human rights in China and increased economic interchange with the rapidly growing economies in the region must now be added the policy objective of non-proliferation or counter-proliferation, an objective identified by the administration as one of its top priorities. We need to adopt a strategic policy approach to China, one that is significantly influenced, although not exclusively dominated, by the nuclear proliferation dilemma posed by North Korea. At least some elements of the North Korean leadership understand that the worsening domestic economic situation and the accelerating gap between the North and the South in Korea increasingly will threaten the country's political and economic survival. The United States must use the leverage provided by the desperate straits in North Korea to help persuade that country to abandon its nuclear program. Any serious attempt to design a package of sanctions must center on cutting off North Korea's imports of oil. However, if the prospect of an oil cutoff is to be credible, Chinese cooperation is indispensable. China accounts for about 2/3 of North Korea's current oil imports, most of which are delivered via pipeline. Should it so decide, China could easily provide all of North Korea's current oil needs, even if a naval blockade cut off tankers delivering oil from other suppliers. At a minimum, China needs to be convinced not to replace oil imports from other suppliers that might be cut off. With China's support, manipulation of oil imports could prove to be an important source of leverage. Without that cooperation, economic measures are certain to be ineffective and to leave more forceful actions as the only alternative. While China may not need to be convinced that a more mature North Korean nuclear capability is not necessarily in its interests, it will have to be persuaded that the North Korean nuclear problem requires urgent action, and the United States has in mind a strategy that can succeed with their active involvement, but will fail without Chinese involvement, leaving only worse and starker alternatives. But if United States-China cooperation on the North Korean issue is to be realized, that cooperation must take on a strategic dimension, grounded in serious dialogue about mutual security interests and concerns that would benefit the U.S.-Chinese relationship more generally. Only if the North Korean issue is placed in a strategic framework, rather than submerged in the current agenda of MFN and human rights, can one realistically expect to convince the Chinese that the North Korean nuclear problem is not only serious, but requires urgent action. The issue is not one of ignoring our bilateral differences with China over human rights or conditioning MFN status because of these differences, but rather to find common ground on an issue of mutual importance that transcends the bilateral issues. If this goal can be reached, it would hold the promise of a constructive, multilateral, or regional approach to North Korea's march toward nuclear weapons, of putting our key bilateral relationship with China on a new and stronger footing, and of providing a more constructive framework for tackling the bilateral problems of trade and human rights. As Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia and I wrote in February following our trip to South Korea and Japan, and I quote from that report, "We believe that avoiding another war on the Korean Peninsula and preventing the spread of nuclear weapons are our paramount interests in Northeast Asia today. We cannot expect a China that is the object of United States economic sanctions, targeted or not, to participate in sanctions against North Korea." End of quote from that report. As this body continues its deliberations on China's trade status, I would suggest that members place the current debate over targeted sanctions in the larger strategic context that must be shaped by the nuclear proliferation dangers in that part of the world, and the need for the United States to address those challenges in concert with real and would-be friends in the region. We must engage China fully in helping to prevent nuclear proliferation and preserve stability on the Korean Peninsula. The negotiations with North Korea cannot be fruitfully concluded, nor can any economic sanctions be effectively implemented without China's cooperation. The United States must communicate to China that this is the highest priority of our relationship. I thank the Chair.
Mr. President. The Senator from Massachusetts, Mr. Kerry, is recognized under the order previously entered for not to exceed 15 minutes.
Mr. President, I believe that I was under the order to be afforded not to exceed 30 minutes. I would ask unanimous consent that that be the order.
Without objection, that will be the order, and the Senator will be recognized for not to exceed 30 minutes.
I thank the President Pro Tem. Mr. President, the clock is ticking on the MFN issue in China. I would like to congratulate the Senator from Indiana and also incorporate by reference and congratulate the Senator from New Jersey and Montana yesterday on their statements with respect to this issue. We all know that by June 3rd, the President of the United States has to decide whether China has met the conditions of his own executive order in the area of human rights in order to merit the renewal of the most favored nation status. This is going to be a difficult decision to a certain degree, not the least because reasonable people will differ over the degree to which China has fulfilled the human rights conditions set out in that order. It is also, I might add, following up on the comments of colleagues, a critically important decision with far-reaching consequences for our overall relationship with China, with other nations in the region, in Asia, for our role in Asia, and also for our domestic economy, though clearly that ought not to be put first in the context of other considerations. I'd like to discuss this policy for a few moments here with my colleagues, and I think it is important to begin that discussion by focusing on the fact that our present policy or approach of conditioning MFN on the improvement of human rights was almost exclusively rooted in the tragic events that took place 5 years ago in Tiananmen Square. It is not rooted in a 1994 evaluation of the overall relationship or other interests that may have evolved. It is a policy that came out of the grotesque confrontation that shocked all of us at Tiananmen Square, in which students were cut down by Chinese soldiers, run over by Chinese tanks. Those who were not killed were detained, and many were indeed executed. And that, Mr. President, was an event that outraged us, and rightly outraged us, sufficiently so that in response we sought to use any means at our disposal as we thought appropriate, including the renewal of MFN, in order to put pressure on Chinese leaders to release those who were detained and to end the ongoing repression. I supported that policy at that time of being tough and linking MFN. And I am convinced, even to this day, that that was the response that was appropriate at that moment and that we were correct to do that. But, Mr. President, I think it is fair to say that at that time, in 1989, when the Cold War was still in full bloom, when the Berlin Wall was only about to come down, when the Soviet Union still existed, when great power politics confronted us in a different context than it does today, it is fair to say that we leapt at an old and very familiar tool from the Cold War, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which conditions the extension of MFN to communist countries on the freedom of emigration. That's the Jackson-Vanik tool. We should remember that prior to that, China had been receiving MFN routinely every year since 1979, when the Carter administration extended it as part of the normalization of U.S.-China relations. There was little opposition in Congress for years to the extension of MFN on human rights or any other grounds from 1979 to 1989. It was the brutal attack in June of 1989 on those seeking basic rights and freedoms in China that changed all of that. In fact, it could be argued very sufficiently that the period of the Cultural Revolution and the prior period of 1979 to 1989 saw far more brutality and upheaval in China than even today, while it still exists. And during that time, the United States did not condition MFN. In the wake of Tiananmen Square, we sought to use the presumed leverage embodied in the extension of MFN to put pressure on China's leaders to release the pro-democracy activists and to fulfill other human rights conditions. Linking trade and human rights was at that moment an instinctive American response to Chinese repression in the year 1989. It signaled our enormous disapproval of China's behavior and our willingness at that moment to forego whatever benefits we might derive from trade with China for a higher moral purpose at that moment. Mr. President, whether or not that ever achieved its full effectiveness remains a question, because every time Congress threatened to revoke MFN, the Bush administration relied on internal party pressure and the veto to undermine that effort. At best, China's leaders received a blurred message, and at worst, they knew that George Bush would bail them out. Then we came to 1993. Unlike his predecessor, who rejected the idea of linkage from the start, President Clinton very quickly and formally embraced that concept. And in his executive order issued last May, the President set forth 7 criteria human rights conditions that he thought ought to be met in order for China to again obtain MFN this year. I would point out to my colleagues only 2 of those criteria are mandatory. Only 2 are mandatory. And the 2 that are mandatory, China has met. Freedom of emigration and refraining from exporting prison labor products to the United States as required by the 1992 China-U.S. Agreement on prison labor. In addition to that, they were to make significant overall progress in adhering to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, releasing and providing an acceptable accounting for political prisoners, allowing international humanitarian and human rights groups to access to prisoners, protecting Tibet's religious and cultural heritage, and permitting international radio and television broadcasts into China. I think, Mr. President, it's easy to understand why the President of the United States elected to proceed on this course. It reflected the deepest values in this country. It expressed our concern for those denied basic human rights and freedoms. It enjoyed strong support among the American public and support among the Congress, and it was also viewed as reversing a perception that the Bush administration policy had really been too soft, that it had been one at the time of 1989 of appeasement. I want to come to the floor today to suggest, as a number of colleagues have, Mr. President, that in 1994, it may no longer be the appropriate policy for the United States in terms of achieving our objectives in China, and particularly in terms of achieving the objective of human rights. Ever since Secretary Christopher's hostile reception in Beijing in March, China has sent us mixed signals about its full intention to comply with the executive order. On the positive side, as I've said, they seem to have met the 2 mandatory conditions, and they have moved, although not as far as many of us would like, on the 5 remaining conditions. China has issued a high-level statement on its adherence to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but we know they have a considerable distance to go to translate their words into actions. It is now in the process of negotiating an agreement with the ICRC to provide that organization with access to prisoners. Although Chinese officials still refuse to meet personally with the Dalai Lama, they have met with his representatives on several occasions, and they have stated a willingness to meet. They have also taken technical data from us, provided to them by our people on the issue of jamming on the VOA broadcasts, and they have articulated a willingness to cease that. Wang Juntao and Chen Ziming, 2 of the most well-known pro-democracy activists arrested at Tiananmen Square, have been released. At the same time, however, Wei Jinseng, the most prominent democracy activist who was released and then later taken again into custody when Secretary Christopher visited, is still being held. Beijing has yet to release others on the list of the 200-plus prisoners held since Tiananmen Square crackdown. Last week, disturbingly, the central government amended its public order law to broaden further power of the police to detain and restrict the activities of labor and pro-democracy activists and those practicing unsanctioned religions and national minorities such as the Tibetans. So the question will be asked in the next days: have China leaders gone as far as they intend to go? Are they waiting, as in past years, to the sort of final moments to offer up a few tidbits, or are they serious about moving further down the road? The next 2 weeks are going to answer that, Mr. President. But I personally believe China can go further. There isn't any question about that. There is no question about our desire to have them go further. And I urge China to do so in these final days. But, Mr. President, I respectfully submit to my colleagues that if we get bogged down in a debate that is exclusively as to whether or not they have met the executive order, we will be missing the interests of the United States, and we will be avoiding our own responsibility in the United States Senate to protect our interests in the international arena. The question before us is much larger than simple compliance with this executive order. I believe that the President of the United States must recognize and translate into policy that recognition that the past policy of linkage of human rights to MFN, although rooted in the best of intentions, is now outdated and ill-suited to the promotion of the totality of our interests in China. It is, as I said, principally a policy shaped by the image of tanks and protesters in Tiananmen Square. It is geared to the events of 1989, not to the China or the world of 1994. It ignores the interests of the United States itself. It ignores China's power and potential and China's role as a regional and international actor. It ignores our own need to have a viable relationship with China in the post-Cold War period and not a Cold War relationship coming out of the post-Cold War period. Our current policy ignores the realities of the 1994 period. It ignores the realities of our own needs and of the region. And I believe that with the end of the Cold War and the demise of the Soviet Union, China has now become one of the most important foreign policy challenges for the United States that cannot be met with the simplistic response of simply a linkage of MFN for human rights to the exclusion of the many other critical interests that we share with China and with our allies. China accounts for 20% of the world's population. Its economy is the fastest growing in the world, growing at an annual rate of 13% in the last 2 years alone. Today, China is regarded as the largest emerging market in the world. China is the strongest military power in Asia and an independent nuclear power. China is one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations whose vote we count on for Bosnia, for any other number of peacekeeping efforts, and shortly for sanctions against North Korea and for the question of proliferation against Korea. We need the cooperation of China. We cannot afford to adopt a Cold War policy that merely excludes and indeed pushes China away. Unlike Russia, which is in a period of turmoil, China is clearly in a period of rise. Already the major power in Asia, China has the potential to be literally an international superpower. For these reasons alone, the United States needs to have a relationship with China that is of a higher order than that which we have had in the most recent years. But there are other reasons as well, Mr. President. China has a population of 1.2 billion people that are denied basic human rights and fundamental freedoms. China is a purveyor of nuclear weapons-related materials to some of the most dangerous nations in Asia and the Mideast. China poses the largest single security threat to the Asian nations, especially Taiwan. China controls the future of the Tibetan people. China is the power with the most influence over North Korea, as my colleague from Indiana just said. China is one of the key members of APEC and a major player on the range of issues affecting the Asian-Pacific region. China offers a growing and potentially large market for American goods, services, and technology. China is an ecological disaster in the making, and we must be part of the partnership to prevent that disaster. China needs our environmental technology and our know-how in order to avoid that disaster. And China wants our support for its admission to GATT, and we must have China as a partner in writing the new rules of trade in this new world marketplace. Our interests in China, and by extension our interests in the Asian region, dictate that we must have a multi-dimensional relationship with Beijing. But our present policy undermines that very objective and our ability to pursue that multi-dimensional relationship. It puts us in an untenable bind, Mr. President. If China fails somehow to make or to meet our unilateral determination of the expectations on human rights, then, Mr. President, we are forced in this untenable bind to cut the very link that opens China and maintains that multidimensional relationship. The impact of cutting off MFN, Mr. President, is not just an economic impact on the United States, which frankly ought to be tertiary or as far down the line of priorities as anything else. But the fact is that it would be to reverse the very goals and objectives of the United States. It would undermine our ability to promote human rights in China. I underscore that. It would be the very reverse of what we seek to do. If you cut off MFN, you will undermine our current effort to seek human rights in China, undermine our own domestic recovery, undermine our bilateral relationship and all of the objectives that I cited, and undermine the furthering of our own role in Asia. The promotion of human rights, Mr. President, let me make it clear, let there be no doubt about this. The promotion of human rights has been and must continue to be a critical part of our China policy. It's consistent with our national history, it's consistent with our humanitarian traditions, consistent with our values as the world's strongest democracy. Repressive governments throughout the world have been subjected to our condemnation and our pressure, and Mr. President, they ought to be. But China, which has one of the world's worst human rights records, should be no different from the condemnation that we offer to other countries. But the question, Mr. President, is not an either-or for human rights. It is not MFN or human rights. It is a question of how we best prosecute our interests with respect to human rights. China is a signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the cornerstone of the international human rights regime. However, in policy or practice, it has denied citizens many of the rights that are granted under that internationally agreed upon accord. Mr. President, I'm not going to go through the list of those items now, extrajudicial killings, trials that are not fair, and many of China political prisoners sent to re-education through labor camps. Even when they're released, some of China's political prisoners retain criminal records, and they affect their daily lives in countless ways. So, Mr. President, I can come to the floor, and I think I can stand toe-to-toe with any advocate of human rights in China. And I feel as outraged by the incidents of deprivation of those rights as anyone else. But the question to me is, how in 1994 do we best advocate rights and enhance the ability of people in China to be able to have those rights grow and be protected? Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that the full measure of my text be placed in the record. I'm not about to end quite yet. I see my colleagues rise, but at this point I would ask unanimous consent that the full measure of the text be placed in the record as if read.
Without objection, it is so ordered.
Mr. President, although the overall human rights situation in China remains poor, it is very important for us to acknowledge the degree to which portions of the executive order have been met, and also to acknowledge that in the case of China, other more dramatic changes stemming from the decision to open China's economy are taking hold. Today, China is a more open society than at any time since the start of World War II. Access to information has increased dramatically, not only in the southern provinces bordering Taiwan and Hong Kong, but even in the rural areas where satellite dishes today can be seen on the horizon. The practice of religion outside of official churches is growing, despite official attempts to stop it. And I remember visiting in Guangzhou one of those house churches of a pastor who spent years in jail, who today continues to preach to his flock, and whose lectern has had some of the great missionaries of the world speak from it. A middle class is beginning to emerge in China, particularly in those areas such as Guangdong province where foreign investment and trade has blossomed. Parallel with this, Mr. President, there is an improved standard of living greater worker stability, and more economic choice for citizens in those areas. For many Chinese citizens, the old work unit that used to control their lives is breaking down, and now it is no longer the determinant of everyday aspect of their lives. Better living standards and greater economic choice are no substitute, obviously, for fundamental political rights, but they are developments which we should encourage and not cut off. Beijing's leaders have made a deliberate decision to open China's economy and markets to the outside world. We need to take advantage of that decision, not play into the hands of hardliners who would shut the door and go back to the age of being able to do everything and anything without the ability of the outside world to look in and even to object. Mr. President, I believe that our companies and our businessmen cannot transform China into a Western society, but they can expose Chinese people to our culture and our values and our ideas. And frankly, Mr. President, we ought to have a little more confidence in the power of our ideas to act as a weapon. We should act more confidently about this opportunity to spread our ideas and our values rather than to want to shut the door and breach the relationship and negate the very access to the ideas which are, after all, the foundation of everything that we do. Over time, exposure to those ideas and values will have a profound impact on Chinese society and culture. Cutting off MFN would undermine the very process that is bringing change to China. It will remove our companies, handicap our companies, reduce our presence. It will close China off to ideas and to knowledge. It will minimize, if not eliminate, our direct influence in their development. It will turn that over, cede it to many of our competitors, and in fact, possibly even be a breach that would take 10 to 15 years in the repair. In short, it would make us a bit player in a production of enormous proportions. It would not only reduce our ability to produce human rights, Mr. President, it might even eliminate it. Cutting off MNFN would transform our bilateral relationship into a new Cold War confrontation, diminishing our ability to influence China on a whole range of other issues important to us. It would escalate the price of Chinese goods, making them unaffordable for lower-income Americans, causing profit losses to many American companies. American investors would find business deals going to their Asian and European counterparts, and that would reduce our influence not just in China, but it will reduce our influence in all of the rest of Asia and indeed possibly in other parts of the world. A confrontational relationship will increase the insecurity that other countries in the region feel, and it will reduce our ability to encourage peaceful resolution of economic and political and military conflicts in that region. So clearly the stakes surrounding this question are high for us. They are also high for China. We should not avoid that reality. We are an important and growing market for them, and they do have a $25 billion trade surplus with us. And as I mentioned earlier, they do need our technology. But China is not facing fundamentally serious security threats at present. And I think it is important that we understand the high stakes involved, make it incumbent on the President to consider changing this policy. Undoubtedly, some are going to argue that this means sacrificing our commitment to human rights. I just don't agree with that, Mr. President. I think they miss the point. Delinking does not force us to choose one interest above the other. It allows us to pursue all of our interests simultaneously. It liberates us from the false choice embodied in this linkage. Beijing needs to understand that we regard human rights as a legitimate issue in the bilateral relationship, that we will react negatively and decisively if there's another event like a Tiananmen Square, that we will continue to press China to abide by internationally recognized norms and standards. And in turn, we in Washington need to understand that there are many ways to press our case on human rights, that we can't unilaterally compel China to comply, and that public confrontations, except in extraordinary circumstances, should not be the norm of our relationship and will, generally speaking, yield less results than this normal bilateral discourse that we normally had prior to 1989. So I believe, Mr. President, that a new policy toward China must be multidimensional and, where necessary, and far more importantly, multilateral. If we reduced or cut off MFN to China, we'd be the only nation in the world that did it. Not one of our allies in the world would stand with us in that decision. So we need to press the multilateral effort. We need to allow the United States and China to discuss differences without destroying the overall bilateral relationship. We need to be flexible enough to respond to changing circumstances. We need to enable us to interact with all levels of Chinese society, including those that are striving for greater freedom. And we must combine carrots and sticks in a meaningful and effective way. In our efforts to promote change in China, and if they are successful, we need to strengthen our support for those inside China who are pressing for change. And this is essential if we're going to make it clear to the Chinese people and the leadership in Beijing that we have not abandoned our commitment to human rights. We are simply changing the tools by which we are seeking to promote them. I believe, Mr. President, we should establish a human rights assistance program to be administered out of the U.S. Embassy in Beijing and the U.S. Consulate in Hong Kong, and provide direct assistance to human rights activists. These programs could provide legal aid information, technical assistance, financial support for grassroots undertakings when possible. To make it clear to the Chinese authorities that we are watching what they are doing, we should designate a full-time human rights officer in our embassy in Beijing and in each of our consulates in China. We should establish a code of conduct for American companies in China, akin to the Sullivan Code adopted for American companies in South Africa in the 1980s. I believe we should continue to press the human rights agenda in the multilateral fora, making our allies understand that the only effective form of pressure in Beijing and human rights is multilateral. I believe that we should maximize the flow of information into China through expanded radio and television broadcasting. And I believe, Mr. President, that in addition, there should be international exchange program increases. These are the most proven methods of exposing other nations to our values and ideas. China's need for Western and particularly American know-how and technology provides us with a ready-made opportunity to do this. Existing U.S. government exchange programs with China, such as the Fulbright, should be expanded. New ones should be developed in those areas where China is reaching outward. For example, China desperately needs to establish a rule of law to regularize commercial and financial transactions. They need more trained lawyers and judges. The establishment of a legal exchange program would be attractive to the leaders in Beijing, and at the same time it would promote Western values and procedures. We need to find ways to support the Tibetan struggle to preserve their culture and society. For example, the Senate version of the Foreign Relations Authorization Bill this year contains an effort by Senator Pell, the chairman, to establish a small exchange program for Tibetan students. I believe, Mr. President,
The time of the senator has expired.
I thank the chair, and I ask unanimous consent that the final comments be placed in the record as if read.
Without objection, you so order.
Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri, Mr. Danforth, recognized for not to exceed 5 minutes.
Mr. President, let me say that I think that the comments of the senator from Massachusetts are very important comments. I certainly associate myself with the senator's conclusion. As the senator pointed out, the continued linkage of MFN status for China and human rights conditions within China is not now suited to the interests of either human rights or the interests of the United States. Mr. President, we have had a lengthy debate in our country, between people who think that it's a good idea and people who do not think it's a good idea to link trade policy with various other objectives we might have. I have been a senator who has been very wary, very skeptical of attempts to condition trade relations on other objectives. That's been hotly contested in the Senate, but I would say, as somebody who has been skeptical about such attempts, that I recognize that those who do want to get some handle on human rights within China, that they are representing the finest traditions of the United States. I don't think it's a good strategy to use, but I recognize what they're trying to do, and I compliment them, because who can turn a blind eye to human rights abuses in other parts of the world? It's very characteristic of American principles to try to do something about China and about human rights. But as the senator from Massachusetts has just pointed out, the fact of the matter is that continued linkage will not serve the purpose of human rights in China. There is no reasonable likelihood that it would do anything other than make matters worse within China to continue such linkage. It would clearly be contrary to the commercial interests of the United States, to job opportunities of the United States. In short, it simply would not work. At a time when the most significant foreign policy challenge we face in the world is nuclear proliferation in North Korea, clearly the cooperation of China, political approach right now to trying to resolve the conundrum we're in with respect to MFN and China is that the administration will somehow try to compromise the issue, to cut the baby in half, to have some kind of partial maintaining of the linkage of MFN and human rights, or, as Senator Kerry pointed out, and really I think one of the few points where I disagreed with this comment, some sort of code of conduct for American businesses that are doing business in China. It's the view of this senator that that would be a mistake. That the efforts to have a partial MFN linkage, that the efforts to have a code of conduct for American businesses would get us in basically the same soup that we're in right now. So I would urge the administration not to do that, and to take the very simple position that continued linkage is not in the best interests of the United States, continued linkage is not in the best interests of human rights in the People's Republic of China, and it is not in the best interests of maintaining peace in the world.
Senator from Louisiana, Mr. Johnston.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be allowed to proceed for 8 minutes under Senator Bradley's time. I believe that was the arrangement.
Without objection, it is so ordered. The senator from Louisiana is recognized for 8 minutes.
Mr. President, I wish to associate myself with the remarks of the distinguished senator from Missouri, as well as the outstanding statement of the senator from Massachusetts, Mr. Kerry, on China and MFN. I believe their statements were totally persuasive, totally correct, and at the very primary interest of this country. Mr. President, the question, I believe, as the senator from Missouri posed, is really not whether we will deny MFN altogether to China. I think that would be an act of such abject foolishness that this country would really not consider that, notwithstanding the fact that calls for that come occasionally from members of the Congress. That really is not the question. The question, as the senator from Missouri says, whether we will take some half step, some cutting of the baby in two, as he calls it, something like, for example, an embargo on goods made by the Chinese military, an increase of the tariff from 8% to 10%, or some half action that would be designed politically to please both sides in this conflict. Mr. President, I very strongly would urge the administration not to take what I believe would be a very foolish action because it is not likely to achieve any of the results that those who seek it would have it do. There is no paradigm for these half actions, for an increase in the tariff related to one country based on human rights. There's no paradigm for a partial embargo on such items as goods made by the military, nor would it be possible to identify the goods that are made by the military or goods that are made by the government, because in China, in this period of transition, determining what is made by purely private enterprise and what is made by the government is very difficult to discern. I assume if we took one of these half actions that it would call for an annual review. Well, Mr. President, I think the events of this year show that an annual review of MFN, an annual grading, in effect, of the actions of a prideful and sovereign foreign country are not likely to be effective. The real question is, what is China's reaction likely to be to one of these partial actions? Well, Mr. President, when you talk about China and MFN, I believe there are three operative words or phrases: pride, stability, and the law of unintended consequences. Mr. President, we should not underestimate the role that pride plays in this whole scenario with China. Those who know history, and I know the present occupant of the chair is without peer in his knowledge of history, will know that China is one of the oldest civilizations in the world, one of the most developed civilizations in the world. Indeed, the Chinese now and always have called their country the Middle Kingdom, the center, in effect, of the world. They have always considered it such. And yet, Mr. President, in late centuries, China has been the subject of great abuse. The Opium Wars in the late 1830s and early 1840s were a war fought, caused by the British policy of insisting that they send opium and open the opium markets in China. If there was ever a case of abuse of a country by a foreign power, the Opium Wars and the policy that begat that war show it. This is a country that has been subjected to gunboat diplomacy, that has been occupied 3 times in the last 150 years, that caused Mao Zedong on October the 1st, 1949, when he finally took over, he said, with great resonance around the country, he said, "The Chinese people have stood up. They will never again be humiliated." Mr. President, Mao's words and the pride that they bespeak of the Chinese people and the Chinese leadership should not be lost on our foreign policy makers, because the Chinese will not be pushed around, Mr. President. They will not have the United States try to impose its value system, its culture system upon them. Right or wrong, their history, their culture, their feelings, their innermost feelings dictate this. If, therefore, we undertook some kind of action against the Chinese, surely they would retaliate, and surely the retaliation is easy to do. They can retaliate on fertilizers, where we have a tremendous market, and I might say from my state we ship a lot of fertilizers, in agricultural products, in aircraft, in Boeing, telecommunications, energy, particularly energy efficiency. Mr. President, they can retaliate very easily just in the trade market. Now, I agree with my friend from Massachusetts when he says this should not be a dollars and cents where you, in effect, worry about American jobs for human rights. That is not the trade-off, but that is part of the equation. The effect of denying of MFN, by some estimates, would result in the loss of 10 million jobs in China if it were a total revocation. What it would do to our relationship with Korea, where the Chinese have been our strong allies, no one can say. it is clear it would not be a salutary effect on that relationship. And more to the point, Mr. President, what would be the action of the People's Liberation Army, which is one of the most conservative groups in China? China has its doves and its hawks just as we do. And the People's Liberation Army constitute the hawks, constitute what we would call the conservatives, constitute those who say that China has done too much to placate America, saying that China has done too much in terms of being humiliated by the United States. The PLA and what they represent, desiring a larger proportion of the budget of China, could very well spark a new Cold War, where they build up here and we have to build up in retaliation to that. Finally, Mr. President, there is the question of stability. China is one of the most dynamic growing, it is the most dynamic growing country in the world. The largest country in the world at 1.2 billion people. It had a growth rate last year of 13% real. It has had a growth rate of over 7% for decades and decades. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be allowed to proceed under Senator Bradley's time for an additional 5 minutes.
Without objection, it is so ordered. The senator is recognized for 5 additional minutes.
Mr. President, this growth, this transition from a total command economy to a capitalist economy, a free market economy, leads to tremendous instabilities in China, vast differences in wealth, tremendous unemployment as formerly government-owned and run enterprises are phased into the free enterprise system. Mr. President, it is